I'm going to talk about some of the data that we've been collecting for a little while that underpins the development of the National Workforce Development Strategy. So an introduction to ACELG, it's the Australian Centre of Excellence for Local Government. It was established in 2009. It has initial funding support from the federal government, and it's a consortium of professional associations and local government professionals, local and universities. It includes the University of Technology Sydney, which is where we're based. It includes the University of Canberra. It includes the Australia and New Zealand School of Government, which runs and develops a Excellence in Local Government Leadership program for our centre, for local government leaders. It includes LGMA National, and it includes the Institute of Public Works Engineering Australia. And that mix of academic organisations and professional associations has served us very well. The centre operates, I'll draw your attention to the bottom part of the slide. The centre operates across 6 program areas, and even though we have 6 distinct program areas, they are intertwined and they overlap. We have a research and policy foresight program, and we had a very successful research forum earlier this week for local government practitioners who are involved in research for councils. We have an innovation and best practice program. We have a governance and strategic leadership program. We have a organisation capacity building program, which is primarily focused around asset and financial management. We have a rural, remote and Indigenous local government program, which is specifically targeting the needs of councils mainly in the north of Australia. And we have the workforce development program, which is where a lot of the work that we're presenting and discussing today sits under. So in terms of our workforce development program, with thanks very much to Victoria Daly, Regional Council as it is now, Shire as it was when this photograph was taken, it's to address the specific skill shortages and gaps in the professional workforce, as well as broader requirements for enhanced expertise and to establish local government as an employer of choice. And through our centre we operate 2 main streams under the Workforce Development Program. The first is the Local Government Practice Unit, which is headed up by Angela at the LGMA in Melbourne. And we have another stream which we call the Learning in Local Government Program, which is aimed at professional development opportunities for local governments across the country, and that's headed by the UTS Centre for Local Government. We have a number of other workforce development activities operating across the centre through other streams such as our research and policy foresight program, and particularly through our rural, remote and Indigenous local government program, because we know that that cohort of councils has a lot of difficulty in workforce issues, particularly in attraction and retention of personnel. So I'm about to present to you the findings and the implications of a national data set on the local government workforce. It's combined of 2 sets of data sources. The first is from a survey of Australian local governments that was undertaken in December 2012 through to early 2013. That survey resulted in 232 councils from across the country participating, and the participants included a range of councils from metropolitan areas, regional areas, rural and remote councils who all participated. So we have a fairly good representation of the different sorts of councils that we have operating in Australia. And we compared those results with other known data sources to ensure that the data was verifiable and robust, primarily with the ABS, and we published a profile or a summary profile of the workforce late last year. One of the key findings is that the local government workforce is more evenly spatially distributed across the country or across geographical areas than any other spheres of government. So quite surprisingly for me, because I thought state government would be out in the regions equally as much as local government has almost equal representation across urban centres, across regional centres and across rural centres, far more so than federal and state governments. And as I said, it was surprising to me that we're more evenly distributed than the state government, because I thought with health and education they might have more of a presence. Compared to other sectors, only mining and agriculture are more prevalent in the regions. And so that really sort of reinforces our mantra, which has been, if you want to strengthen local government, strengthen the regions, because local governments everywhere has a really strong presence in the regions. It's often the major employer or the only employer, and so if we want to strengthen the regions, strengthen local government because they're there, they're a system of governance, they're providing services, often on behalf of other levels of government, and it's important that we support their presence in the regions. Local government has a significantly older workforce than the national average, particularly in the 50 to 59 age cohort. And that age cohort will shortly be retiring, although in 25 years' time they'll be still working for another few years. But it sends a signal to us that we really need to be thinking about this cohort of workers who will be retiring very soon, and how we're going to replace them, and who we're going to replace them with, and where we're going to get them from. Gender, we have 46.2% of the workforce is female compared to 53.8% male. So the majority of employees are males. However, when we look at specific work groups and individual occupations, there's a lot of gender disparity. So for example, 96% of childcare employees are female, and 90% of local government building surveyors are male. So there's some opportunities to address some of that gender imbalance in the workforce. Education levels. We found that females in local government are more likely to be higher educated than their male counterparts. And we found that there were lower levels of attainment for older males in regional and rural centres. So there's clearly a cohort of highly educated females in our workforce that, with the right sort of development, we could be nurturing to stay on in the sector and perhaps move into leadership roles. Because this next slide says that we need to do some work in that area. This next slide shows that the senior level of management in councils is significantly males over 50 years old. We have a little bit better representation of females in the managers area, and the females are are better represented in the coordinated team leader level. And as I said earlier, we have the females are more likely to be higher educated than their male counterparts. So there's lots of opportunities to look at those highly educated females in the sector and promote them from those lower levels. A colleague of mine who shall remain nameless, and I've copped a lot of flack for this, including from one of the CEOs in the front row, but the characteristic that the senior echelon of management has unkindly, or perhaps justifiably, depending on your opinion, been called male, pale and stale. So I leave you, and please don't take offence at that, because as I said at the women's breakfast the other day, it's a flippant comment, but we really should be thinking about that cohort of males in senior positions and how we're going to firstly replace them, but secondly draw on their knowledge and experience, which is vast, and they have really strong leadership capabilities. They've served the local government sector very well. So how do we try to keep them engaged in our sector in some way and nurture the next round of talent? Again, age by occupation with the highest number of employees aged over 50 are likely to be CEOs or general managers in New South Wales or Tasmania, labourers and plant operators, community transport operators and bus drivers, HAC, childcare and community services workers, works and infrastructure managers, and finance and payroll areas. The occupations with the lowest number of employees aged 50 plus in the communications and media fields, urban planners and environmental planners, folks engaged in community engagement, lifeguards and fitness instructors, those in the IT fields, greenkeepers and people employed in the arts and culture. Indigenous employment. The COAG public sector Indigenous employment target is 2.6% by 2015. Local government far exceeds that target. We have 4.62% of our employees identify as Indigenous, thanks largely to the Northern Territory, which has over 55% of the workforce identifying as Indigenous. Now, We treat this slide with great caution because most of the employees in this, represented in the Northern Territory and some in Queensland as well, are employed under CDEP schemes, which are no longer, this data is from the 2011 census. So a number of those employees are now no longer holding positions or CDEP positions because employment programs have changed. So that slide will change dramatically after the next election, we suspect. However, it does demonstrate that local government has been successful in employing an Indigenous workforce. Attraction and retention, this is relatively new data for us. It just came to our attention over the last couple of days. So between the 2006 and 2011 census, local government retention rates was around about 49%. And this is on a par with the federal government, which retained 48% of its workforce. But it's significantly lower than the state government, which retained 56% of its workforce. Of the employers that left the sector, approximately 78% went to the private sector, while 20% shifted to other levels of government. 4.5% went to the federal government and 15.5% went to the state government. Again, this is on a par with the federal government, where 78% of employees who left went to the private sector. And again, it's significantly lower than the state government, where 88% went to the private sector. Of all of the new local government employees between 2006 and 2011, approximately 60% of them came from the private sector, while 12% came from other levels of government, specifically 3% from federal and 9% from state. So local government is drawing from the private sector. And this is lower than other levels of government, where 68% of new federal government employees and 63% of new state government employees came from the private sector. Significantly, 26% of new local government employees did not come from the private sector or other levels of government. That is, that they were entering the workforce for the first time or came having had a period of unemployment. And the most common occupations to leave local government, probably not surprisingly, are professional and trade workers, clerical and administrative workers, labourers and machinery operators. And we need to do more analysis of that data, but it could be that labourers, machinery operators, professionals and trade workers are perhaps heading to the mining sector. Local government is a place-based employer. Not unsurprisingly, urban local governments have the highest proportion of employees coming from other local government areas. So in other words, employees working in urban local governments are not as likely to be living in their LGA as other parts of the country. However, we know that regional local governments that function as a lifestyle centre, like sea change, tree change centres, draw all of their employees from the surrounding region. So for example, Byron Shire, which has a lovely lifestyle, but so does the surrounding region, only 50% of its workforce comes and lives in the Byron Shire area, and the remainder come from the surrounding region, such as Tweed, Lismore and Ballina. And we also know that small rural shires are most likely to have all of their employees living within the LGA. So I suppose we kind of always knew that, but it's good to have it validated from the data. We also found that rural shires on the urban fringe are more likely to attract employees from the adjacent urban centre or urban area. So for example, in Nillumbik Shire, the employees also live in Nillumbik, while the remainder come largely from Whittlesea and Banyule surrounding those areas. We've got some new data on the Indigenous local government workforce. We know that around about 5% of the workforce at the 2011 census were Indigenous. We now know that this surpasses state and territory local governments, where only 2% of the workforce is Indigenous, and the federal government has 1.5% of its workforce as Indigenous, and the private sector is 1.3%. We know that 20% of all Indigenous employees were employed under the Community Development Employment Scheme, and we know that 30% of all Indigenous people employed under the CDEP program were employed by local government. So local government's making a really strong contribution to the employment of Indigenous people. We know that the public sector is the second largest employer of Indigenous people, surpassed only by the healthcare and social assistance sectors, and education and training, followed by construction and mining. And while local government makes up only 9% of the public sector workforce, 22% of all Indigenous public sector employees are employed by a local government. And this compares with state governments, which employ 64% of the public sector workforce and 59% of the Indigenous public sector workforce. The federal government employs 26% of the public sector workforce and 19% of the Indigenous public sector workforce. We did a small case study looking at Roper Gulf Shire Council using the known census data. Anyone here from Roper Gulf? I didn't see anyone. I know we've got some reps from the Northern Territory, but not Roper. The census data tells us that 80% of residents of Roper Gulf are Indigenous. It tells us that there's 412 employees in total, and 378 are Indigenous. Local government is the single largest employer in the council area, accounting for 21% of the 1,900 jobs. Local government employs more Indigenous people than any other industry in Roper Gulf Shire. Mining has 14% Indigenous, education and training 45%, and agriculture and forestry 25%. We know from looking at the website that all of the council, almost all of the councils, including the mayor, are Indigenous, and everybody knows Tony Jack. He makes a great presence in Canberra when he attends the ALGA meetings. And most of the council's Indigenous employees are health and welfare support workers, carers and aides, farm, forestry and garden workers. So this again further supports our mantra that if you strengthen local government, we can also strengthen the regions and Indigenous communities. So my final slide is just a summary of the implications from some of that data, and data collection for data collection's sake is no use unless we do something with the data. And the reason that we collected the data is to inform policy making. So we know that the implications of the data are that local government can play an active and leading role in intergovernmental relations and collaboration to enhance regional and rural community outcomes. And if I can get you to all chant, strengthen regions, strengthen local government, I'd be very happy. And despite females being more likely to be higher educated, they're significantly underrepresented in senior leadership roles. There's an opportunity to increase gender equity across particular occupation groups, such as the childcare workers and building surveyors that we spoke about earlier. There's an opportunity to nurture and encourage educated women into senior leadership positions. We know from the data and from practice and case studies that the attraction and retention of talent can be achieved through the promotion of flexible working conditions, and a number of local governments are leading the way there and having strong attraction and retention rates as a result. We know that there's a large proportion of engineering and infrastructure personnel who are soon to retire, and that obviously will have implications for the infrastructure backlog that we all talk about in local government. We can't really address that if we haven't got the workers to help us. And local government is leading the public sector in terms of Indigenous employment, but those figures are very, very vulnerable, and opportunities could be lost if we don't have access to more programs to employ Indigenous people, particularly in regional and remote areas. So that concludes my presentation.